Hi and welcome, I'm Gavin Lon. In this video, we are going to build a basic React front-end that queries a web API component written in C#. So by going through this video, you'll learn one of the easiest ways to create a React application that leverages a .NET Web API component. We'll code this application using Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition, which can be downloaded free of charge. I've included a link in the description of this video that points to where you are able to download Visual Studio 2022 Community Edition for both Windows and macOS platforms. The function of this basic application enables users to rank items by dragging and dropping the relevant items, for example, well-known movies, onto a grid. Each cell in the ranking grid denotes a ranking value. So basically, the item that has been dragged to the top left ranking cell is ranked number 1. The item to the immediate right of the top left ranking cell denotes a ranking value of 2, and so on. The worst possible ranking is 16, denoted by the cell in the bottom right cell of the ranking grid. This is of course not an original app, but I thought this would be a great way to demonstrate writing a basic React front-end that leverages a web API component that runs on .NET 6. Okay, so as you can see, I got myself a green screen. The only problem that I can think of about having a green screen is that you run the risk of getting carried away. Okay, so I'm glad I got that out of my system. Let's get into this video. Let's fire up Visual Studio 2022. The project template that we want to use for this project is named ASP.NET Core with React.js. So let's select this item and press the next button. Let's name our project Ranking App. Let's press the next button. As you can see, we are going to build the .NET part of this application on .NET 6. Let's press the Create button. Great! Let's take a brief look at the project structure that has been automatically generated for us based on the project template that we have chosen. To access the client-side code, we can open the Client App folder here. Then we can look at the React components that have been automatically generated within the src/components folder. We have the counter component, the fetch data component, and the home component. Then to look at the auto-generated server-side .NET code, we can open the controllers folder here. Here we have the Weather Forecast Controller class, which contains code for a .NET Web API component. If we look here, we have the getAction method that represents the get verb pertaining to a HTTP GET request. This method returns an array containing made-up weather forecast related data. This code has been generated for us through the use of the relevant project template to give us an example of how the interaction between the front-end React code and the .NET backend Web API code can be implemented in our project. The React client component named fetchData calls the Weather Forecast.NET Web API component and displays the weather forecast data returned from the GET request to the browser. The counter component demonstrates basic React functionality. But when we click the Fetch Data menu option, the code within the Fetch Data React component is invoked and calls the Weather Forecast server-side .NET Web API component and displays the data that is returned as an array to the client on the user's browser. You can see that the ASP.NET Core with React.js project template automatically generates code for us to facilitate the integration of a .NET Web API component with the client-side code implemented using React.js. So let's create a folder here named Models. Let's add a C# class to the Models folder, and let's name our class Item Model. In this video, we are going to develop a basic application that enables a user to rank movies and albums. We'll first create the code whereby a user can use our application to rank a collection of movies. But we want our model class to be generic, so the Item Model class can also be used to represent, for example, albums or other types of items we want users to be able to rank using our application. So the Item Model class can represent any type of item that we may wish to integrate into our application. So this helps our application to be extensible. Let's include an ID auto-implemented property of type integer. Let's include a string property named title. Let's include an integer property named image ID. Each item will have an associated image. Our application will contain a collection of images that are uniquely identifiable. So each item will be associated with one specific image. An item has a one-to-one relationship with an image in the system. You'll clearly see how this works as we progress with the creation of this application. Let's include an integer property named ranking. This property represents the ranking value that a user can assign to a particular item. Let's include an item type property of type integer. In this application, we are going to allow for the user to rank a collection of movies as well as albums. So we are going to assign movies the item type identifier value of 1, and albums the item type identifier value of 2. So item types have a one-to-many relationship with the items in our system. This will be clarified as we progress with the development of the application. So let's create our controller class within the controllers folder. Let's add a class and name it Item Controller. This class will contain an action method that will service HTTP GET requests from clients. When a valid request is made to the relevant GetAction method, the action method will query a collection of items and return an array of items for a specific item type to the appropriate React client component. So for example, if the client requests an array of items that have an item type of 1, an array of items representative of movies will be returned to the client. So to make our class a controller class, let's first make our item controller class inherit from the controller base class. Let's press Control period and bring in the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC namespace. The next step in making our class a controller class is to decorate the item controller class with the API controller attribute. In order to declare appropriate routing information for our controller class, let's appropriately decorate our item controller class with the root attribute. Let's pass in the text controller wrapped in square brackets as an argument to the constructor of the root attribute. So I want to keep the server-side web API component code really basic because the focus of this tutorial is how to easily implement interaction functionality between a React client and server-side web API code implemented using .NET. So for the sake of this basic example, we are going to implement the data on the server side as a static collection rather than, for example, storing the relevant data in a SQL Server database in a database table. If this was a real-world application, of course, we'd want to persist the relevant data in, for example, a relational database storage facility like SQL Server, or perhaps a NoSQL storage facility like MongoDB. We could then use, for example, Entity Framework Core to interact with whichever storage facility we have chosen. So within our item controller class, let's create a private static read-only IEnumerable collection that is strongly typed with our user-defined type item model. Let's name our collection items. Note that rather than follow me here tapping away at the keyboard to declare and populate our items collection, you can copy the relevant code from this URL that points to an appropriate GitHub web page. So you can see here, we have in our collection references to well-known movies. The Godfather, Highlander, Highlander 2.
There can be only one.
The Last of the Mohicans, Police Academy 6, Rear Window, Roadhouse, The Shawshank Redemption, Star Trek 4, The Return Home, and Superman 4. So this get action method accepts an argument of type integer, named item type. Let's create a link query that queries our collection of items in order to filter the items collection based on the item type value passed in from the code that we'll write a bit later within a React component. Note that at the moment the items in our collection denote movies, so only one type of item is currently stored within our collection. Later on we'll extend our code whereby albums will be stored within this collection. So in order to tell .NET, as it were, that this get method pertains to a HTTP GET request, we must decorate our get action method with the HTTP GET attribute. We must also pass in this text denoting that an argument of type int must be passed as an argument when the relevant GET request is made from the client. Let's create a React component. Let's name this file RankItems.js. For those of you who wish to learn the basics of React or wish to refresh your knowledge, I've recently contributed to a project-based React for Beginners course for freecodecamp.org. I've included a link to this course below in the description of this video. I'm really happy to have contributed to this course, along with two other instructors, John Smilga and Sanjeev Theagarajan. John and Sanjeev are both excellent instructors and very well known. I've included links to their YouTube channels below in the description of this video. Let's write the code to import the useState hook and the useEffect hook into our RankItems component. Let's create a basic structure for our functional component. Let's write the code to return some basic JSX code from our component. Let's write code to implement the useState hook so that React can track the state of the items collection returned from the server through the code that we have just implemented for our item controller class. So you can see here, we have a destructured array returned from the useState hook. The first variable returned pertains to the items collection data that will be initially retrieved from our server-side code, and the second variable pertains to a function that can be used in our React component to change the state of the items variable. We'll appropriately implement the code to change the state of the items array in just a bit. Note that at the moment, we are setting the items array to an empty array by default. This is denoted by the empty square brackets we are currently passing in as an argument to the useState hook here. So when our RankItems component first loads, we want our code to call the appropriate Web API component in order to retrieve the relevant items collection data from the server, and then we want our code to change the state of the items array. We are able to implement code that executes when our component first loads by using the useEffect hook in a specific way. To achieve this, we need to pass a function as the first argument to the useEffect hook, and pass empty square brackets denoting an empty array as the second argument to the useEffect hook. Let's write code for an anonymous function that we are passing as an argument to the first parameter of the useEffect hook. So we want our code to return a collection of movie data from our Web API component. We can use JavaScript's fetch method to make an appropriate HTTP GET request to the relevant endpoint. We need to pass a value denoting the item type value to the server. In the rules of our application, a value of 1 for the item type argument means we want to return a collection containing data for movies. A value of 2 for the item type argument means that we want the collection to contain data for a collection of albums. We haven't yet added the data to our server-side code for the collection of albums, but we'll start by testing the code for retrieving a collection of movie data. So the data type variable on the client has been initialized to 1, which means the relevant Web API server-side code should return a collection of items with an item type of 1, movie data. The data is returned in JSON format. If our code gets to this point and a valid collection of movie data has been successfully returned from our Web API component, we can use the setItems function to change the state of our items variable. When a variable state is tracked through the use of the useState hook and its state is changed, this means that the state of the component has changed. When the state of a React component changes, the React component is re-rendered. So the code within the returned JSX code is transpiled into code that a web browser understands before it is re-rendered inside the user's browser window. The code is appropriately re-rendered really fast, which is what makes React such a great choice for implementing user interactive front-end code for the web. So, we have now created basic code for our RankItems component that retrieves appropriate data from the server, then changes the state of our component, which results in our component being appropriately re-rendered. The next step is to appropriately modify the approutes.js file. Let's open the approutes.js file. Let's modify the approutes array in order to add a new route that points to our RankItems component, as it were. We must of course also write code to import the RankItems component into our approutes component. Great! So we have told React, as it were, about how to access the RankItems component through the code that we have just written within the approutes component. The next step is to include the relevant link within the nav menu component to provide a way for the user to navigate to the RankItems component, as it were. Let's open the file named navmenu.js. let's appropriately include a nav item element and include a nav link child element within the nav item parent element. Let's ensure that the path that we have appropriately included for the RankItems component within the app roots array is appropriately included within our new nav link element. We can do this by appropriately assigning the relevant path to the RankItems component to the to property of the nav link element. Let's run our code and test whether we can invoke the RankItems component by clicking the appropriate navigation link that we have just created. Okay, so why has that not worked? By using the ASP.NET Core with React.js project template to create our project, code has been automatically included within our project to make the interaction between the React client code and the server-side.NET code easy for us to implement. So all we need to do is tell our client React code, as it were, about our server-side controller class, and we can do this by simply including a reference to item, our item controller class, in the context array, like this. You can see here by default, the context array includes an item denoting the weather forecast controller class that is used by the fetch data React component to retrieve weather forecast data from the server that can then be rendered through the fetch data component. So we can include a new entry into the context array that tells our client-side code, as it were, about the items controller code on the server. Let's run the code. And you can see that our breakpoint has been hit within the getAction method, within the item controller class. Excellent! Our RankItems React component is now successfully communicating, as it were, with the appropriate server-side web API code. And each movie title is rendered to the screen when our RankItems component is re-rendered after the movie data is successfully retrieved from the server, and the setItems client-side function is called to appropriately update the items array with the movie data retrieved from the server. This, of course, changes the state of the RankItems component, and the relevant front-end code is appropriately re-rendered to the browser. Excellent! So if our code was retrieving a large amount of data from the server, it would be a good idea to show a loading indicator to the user while the data is being delivered from the server to the client. Providing such status information to the user provides a better UX, user experience. So to simulate that a large amount of data is being sent from server to client, let's create an artificial delay on the server, like this. So you can see here that an empty array is currently set by default in the relevant useState hook. So of course the array will never be null. So in the return code here, instead of checking for a null value, let's check the number of items in the array. So while the array is empty, i.e. has not yet been brought down from the server, we want a loading indicator to be displayed to the user. Great! So instead of just displaying the movie titles to the user's browser, we want the poster images for each of the movies to be displayed in a list. To do this, let's first create a new React component that has the responsibility of importing movie images into our application. Let's name the relevant React component movieimages.js. Before we write the code for this component, let's create a folder within the src folder named Images. I've prepared the movie images for our application, and they can be downloaded from this location on GitHub. So let's create a folder within the Images folder named Movies. And let's ensure that the images that we have downloaded from the relevant GitHub repository resides within this Movies folder. Let's write the code to import the images from the Movies folder. We can do this by including the appropriate import statements at the top of our movieimages.js React component, like this. If you like this video, please give this video a thumbs up. And please feel free to share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. Please also consider subscribing to the channel and hit the bell icon so that you'll be notified of future content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description of this video. Any donations will be invested into the channel so that I can continue to provide you with high quality content. Let's create an array to store these imported images. Then let's write the code to export our array so that other components can use the array. Within the div element that will wrap the list of movie images that we want displayed from within the RankItems component, let's reference a CSS class that we'll write in just a bit, named items-not-ranked. Then let's write the JSX code to output each of the images to the screen from within our RankItems component. Note that each item that our code traverses has a property named image_id, which corresponds to an ID property of an object stored in the movie img_ar array. Let's write code that uses the JavaScript find method to find the appropriate image for each item. Great, but the images are of course too big, so we must style our images appropriately. Let's first create a div container element for each of the relevant img elements. Let's include a reference to our CSS class for each of our div container elements. Let's call our CSS class unranked-cell. Let's open the custom.css file and create the appropriate styling code. So firstly, let's create the appropriate CSS code for the items-not-ranked class. Let's then create the appropriate CSS code for the unranked-cell class. And let's also create the appropriate CSS code for the img elements that are housed within the div container elements that reference the unranked-cell CSS class. Excellent, and we are now presented with a list of movie images. Each of these images denotes an unranked movie item. So we have now created the functionality for displaying the movies we want our users to rank in a list. So the way in which we want our users to rank the items is by dragging the relevant images onto a grid. The position to where the user drags an image will result in a unique ranking value that corresponds to each cell within the ranking grid being allocated to the relevant item, i.e. the dragged image item, which represents a movie. So for example, when a user drags the image representing the movie The Godfather to the top left position in the grid, the ranking grid, this means that the item is ranked number 1. So the item's ranking value is 1. So each cell in the ranking grid denotes a ranking value. Except for the cells in the leftmost column. These cells are used for labeling purposes. So each cell in the ranking grid denotes a ranking value. The ranking value is positioned for each ranking cell, progressing from left to right and top to bottom by a value of 1, from 1 to 16. So the top left item denotes a ranking value of 1. The item to the immediate right of the cell that denotes a ranking value of 1 denotes a value of 2, and the bottom right item denotes a ranking value of 16. So our UI will give the user a great UX, where the user can simply drag the image representing an unranked item to the chosen position on the ranking grid in order to allocate an appropriate ranking value to the relevant item. A ranking value of 1 denotes the most highly ranked item, and a ranking value of 16 denotes the lowest possible ranking value. Great, so let's create a React component responsible for outputting a grid to the screen that will denote our ranking grid. Let's create a component named RankingGrid.js. Let's first create the basic structure for a React functional component. So we are using destructuring here for the props that the RankItems component will pass down to our RankingGrid component. The RankItems component is the parent component of the RankingGrid child component. So here the items array and the image array are passed down as props to our RankingGrid component. So we are going to create the code for the grid in this component dynamically through appropriately coded JavaScript methods. What I mean by this will become clearer as we develop the code for this component. So firstly, let's declare 5 JavaScript arrays. These arrays will be used to build relevant JSX code that can be outputted from our component. The ranking grid array will store an array of elements that make up the entire ranking grid. The cell collection top array will store the elements that represent the top row in the ranking grid. The cell collection middle array will store the elements that represent the middle row in the ranking grid. The cell collection bottom array will store the elements that represent the second most bottom row in the ranking grid. The cell collection worst array will store the elements that represent the very bottom, where all the worst ranked items will reside, as it were, after being ranked by the user. Let's create the code to return the relevant JSX code. Let's write codes to call a JavaScript method named createRankingGrid that is responsible for outputting the JSX code for our ranking grid. In the createRankingGrid method, a call to a method that we have not yet written is made, named createCellsForRows. This code is returning the returned value from a method that we'll write next, named createRowsForGrid. So let's work backwards, as it were, and create the code for the createRowsForGrid method. So you can see that this code simply pushes JSX elements into a JavaScript array. The first item in the array represents the top row for the ranking grid. The second item in the array represents the middle row in the ranking grid. The third item in the array represents the second to bottom row in the ranking grid. The fourth item in the array represents the very bottom row in the ranking grid. Let's create the code for the method named createCellsForRows. So here our code is looping 4 times, i.e. 1 for each row in the ranking grid. Within the loop, a call to a method named createCellsForRow is made. This method is responsible for creating each cell for a particular row. Let's create the code for the createCellsForRow method. So each row will contain 5 cells. So let's create code to loop 5 times. Each iteration of the loop creates a cell for the relevant row. The first cell in each row does not have a corresponding ranking value and is used to label the relevant row. This means we must avoid assigning a ranking value to cells used for labeling purposes. Let's create an if-else-if ladder, as it were, to assign relevant values for each row. Then let's write code to appropriately call a method that we'll write next, named pushCellMarkup to arr. Let's create the pushCellMarkup to arr method. So the code for this method appropriately populates the cell arrays that we declared earlier on at the top of our code. So if the rankNum variable is greater than 0, we know the cell pertains to a cell that denotes a ranking position in the grid. If the value of the rankNum variable is not greater than 0, this means that the cell is used for labeling purposes and must not be assigned a ranking number. So the markup for a cell that is used for labeling purposes is different to a cell that is used for ranking purposes. You can see that a cell used for ranking purposes has an ID property that is assigned a value with the rank literal text followed by a dash prefix, and this is followed by the cell's ranking value. This is how our code will know, as it were, how to rank an item with an appropriate ranking value once the item has been dragged and dropped into the relevant ranking cell on the ranking grid. So let's open the RankItems React component and write code to import the RankingGrid component into the RankItems component. Let's include the code to call the RankingGrid component from within the code responsible for outputting UI-related code from the RankItems component. Note that we are passing down the appropriate prop values to the RankingGrid component here. Let's run the code. Great, but in order for the RankingGrid to display appropriately, we must include the appropriate CSS code within the custom.css file. So let's do that. Great, and that is starting to look pretty good. Let's add code to our custom.css code so that the output of our components aligns centrally on the horizontal axis. Great! So at this point, we have a list of items that the user can rank. We have also created the functionality for the ranking grid. The user ranks an item by dragging and dropping an item onto the appropriate cell on the ranking grid. Each cell, with the exception of the cells used for labeling each row in the ranking grid, serves as a ranking position. So if a user drags an item onto the top left-hand ranking cell, that item's ranking value will be 1. If the user drags an item to the immediate right adjacent top left-hand ranking cell, the relevant item's ranking value will be assigned a value of 2, and so on. The bottom right cell in the ranking grid denotes a ranking value of 16. Okay, so we want to provide the user with a great user experience. So drag and drop functionality will provide the user with an easy and fun way to rank the relevant items. So let's create the code to facilitate this functionality. Note that the code we are about to create unfortunately will not work for touch screens, i.e. a user will not be able to drag the relevant item by touching the item on the screen and then dragging the item. We'll look at how to create drag and drop functionality using a touchscreen device in an upcoming tutorial. So the functionality we are providing here allows the user to select the item with the user's mouse pointer and drag the item by moving the mouse pointer while keeping the left mouse button suppressed, and dropping the item into the desired cell by dropping the item at the desired location, which is done by releasing the left mouse button when the mouse pointer is hovered over the relevant ranking cell. So to achieve the desired drag and drop functionality, let's first create a method named drag. The code for this method is just one simple line of code. This line of code simply stores the ID value of the item that is being dragged. We'll look at how we are able to retrieve this value in just a bit when we discuss the method responsible for the drop functionality. Okay, let's create a function named allowDrop. So in this method, our code, ev.preventDefault, indicates that the default event that would ordinarily be fired should be cancelled for the target element. So with this code, we are indicating that we are overriding the default behavior here. So let's write the event handler function for the drop method. Let's name the method drop. So firstly, we are writing code to cancel the default event. Our code then references the target element, i.e. the element where we wish to drop the dragged element. So if an image element already exists as a child element within the target element, i.e. where we are attempting to drop an item, we want to disallow this action. So if the user is attempting to drop an item onto an already existing image element, we want code to execute, in this case, to return control back to the calling code without executing any further code in our drop method. So let's appropriately include return false here. Then let's also check to see if the target element contains any child elements. We only want the drop functionality to be performed successfully if the target element does not contain any child elements. So for example, this logic prevents the user from dragging an element over an already existing image in the relevant ranking cell. If the target element does not contain any child elements, we want code to fire that will cause the relevant item in the items array to be changed accordingly. So we want the ranking property of the relevant item to be changed to the ranking value denoted by the cell into which the user is dropping the relevant item. We are managing state for the items array by appropriately using the useState hook. So the change in value of the ranking property of the relevant item will then trigger our RankItems component to be re-rendered, which means the image element that the user has dragged onto the ranking grid will remain in the appropriate cell on the ranking grid. So, once the code has run to change the item's ranking property accordingly, we must use the setItems method to set the state of the items array like this. As discussed, the execution of this line of code will trigger the RankingItems component to re-render. So let's include code within the RankItems return section of the component to pass down references to the methods that we have just created as props to the RankingGrid component. Let's appropriately wire up the relevant drag and drop methods to the cells that represent a ranking position on the ranking grid. Let's include code that adds the relevant image as a child element within the target cell. The image represents an item that has its ranking property set to the ranking value denoted by the appropriate grid cell, i.e. the target cell within the ranking grid. Remember, of course, each cell represents a ranking value from 1 to 16. Let's open the RankingItems.js file and include the relevant drag functionality for the image elements that represent items that the user can rank by dragging and dropping the items to an appropriate position on the ranking grid. So let's test the code. Okay, so that did work, but clearly the image element is way too large within the relevant ranking cell. So let's ensure that we include the appropriate styling code within the custom.css file so that the image element takes up 100% of the height and 100% of the width of its parent cell within the ranking grid. Let's try that again. Great. But when we drag and drop an item from the item list onto the ranking grid, we want the relevant item to disappear from the item list, denoting that the relevant item has been ranked. It's not currently doing this. So we can achieve what we want here by simply including an if condition that checks that only unranked items are included within the item list here. All ranked items should appear within the ranking grid. So our if condition checks the ranking property for each item. If the checked item has a ranking value that is greater than 0, then it should appear in the ranking grid and not the item list. Conversely, if an item has a ranking property with a value of 0, it should be included within the item list and not appear in the ranking grid. So, of course, one of the great things about modern front-end technologies like React, Blazor, or Angular is that we are easily able to neatly wrap our code in components. I can see within the RankItems component an opportunity to further rationalize our code. So let's create 2 more components from the code that we currently have within the return part of our RankItems component. So we can abstract the rendering functionality for each item in our items list within its own component. We can also abstract the code that traverses each item within the item array into its own component. So let's create a component named item that denotes an item within the items array. Let's create a component named item collection that is responsible for traversing each item in the items array. Let's write code to import the item component into the item collection component. Let's write code that traverses each item in the item array in order to appropriately display each item in the user's browser. Let's write code to import the item collection component into the RankItems component. And let's write code to call the item collection component from within the return part of our RankItems component. So we have now provided functionality so that a user can rank a set of movies by dragging an image from a list of items to a position on a grid that we can refer to as the ranking grid. So we have facilitated a drag and drop mechanism for the user that can be utilized to rank the items in the items list. So we are able to rank movies at the moment. What if we wanted to extend the functionality of our application to enable the ranking of other items, for example, albums? So we are able to easily extend our application so that a user can rank other types of items because we have written our code in such a way that it is extensible. We can reuse our components for the purpose of ranking other item types. So let's prove this and write code so that a user can rank albums. Let's first open the item controller class and include these well-known albums that we'd like the user to rank. I've selected a group of well-known albums for this example. Let's include the relevant albums in our collection of item model objects here. Notice that the item type property is set to 2 for albums and the item type property for items that represent movies remains 1. So the item type property in our example distinguishes the types of items stored in our collection on the server. If you don't feel like tapping out the code like I'm doing here, please feel free to copy the relevant code from this GitHub webpage. So the next step is to write code that imports the images for our albums into our React application. So to do this, let's first make a copy of the movie images.js file. Let's rename the copy of the movie images.js file albumimages.js. You can download these album images from this GitHub webpage. We can then copy the relevant downloaded images to a sensible location within our projects. We can then appropriately modify our albumimages.js file so that the images that we have just downloaded are appropriately imported into our React application. Excellent. So we want the user to be able to navigate to the appropriate path where the user can rank the albums. So let's first include an appropriate route in the app route array for this purpose. Let's open the approot.js file. Let's modify our code so that 2 distinct routes are created. One route denotes a path relevant to ranking movies. The other route defines a path relevant to ranking albums. Both paths point to a component that we are going to write in just a bit, named RankItems container. This component will be the parent component for the RankItems component. For the rank movies path, we want specific prop values to be passed down to the RankItems container component. For example, the data type prop is appropriately set to 1. Now, the data type prop on the client is equivalent to the item type property for an item that we have added to a collection on the server. So, when this route is accessed, the state of our application is such that a user can rank movies. A value of 2 is being passed down to the RankItems container for the rank album path, so that the application will be in a state where users can rank albums. The user will be able to put the application in these states through clicking the appropriate top menu items on the UI. We'll create the code for these navigation menu items in just a bit. If you are not clear on the significance of the prop values we are passing down to the RankItems container component for each route path, don't worry, this will become clearer as we progress with the development of this part of the application. Note that we are passing in the relevant image arrays for each of the relevant paths, so we must write code to import the relevant image arrays. Let's open the file that denotes the nav menu component and appropriately include the relevant nav menu items. These items map to the appropriate paths that we have defined within the app.root.js file. Let's create a new file for our RankItems container.js functional component. I'd like to tell you about Brilliant.org. Brilliant.org is a platform used by millions that provides a fun and interactive way of learning STEM subjects. At Brilliant, you'll practice real-world problem solving that helps you train your critical thinking and problem-solving skills. Every problem comes with a step-by-step solution that helps you understand the reason for each step. Courses are available for all knowledge levels and all ages, from 10 to 110. So you'll almost certainly find something that interests you. The concept is first explained and why it actually matters. The intuitive ideas behind the topics, like algebra, statistics, or algorithms, and more, are taught. You'll come to understand how STEM actually works and how it is relevant to your everyday life. Personally, I'm really looking forward to following this course on Python. Python is an excellent object-oriented programming language, one of the best languages used in data science applications. This course on algorithms looks great. Understanding how certain algorithms work, coupled with a good knowledge of certain data structures, is essential for professional developers as well as aspiring developers. All of Brilliant's courses are crafted by award-winning teachers, researchers, and professionals from MIT, Caltech, Duke, Microsoft, Google, and more. This is an excellent platform that almost anyone can use to increase their knowledge on STEM subjects. I highly recommend signing up for your 1-week free trial with Brilliant. By signing up after clicking the appropriate link that I've included below in the description, and if you convert to an annual subscription once your 1-week free trial period has completed, you can get 20% off the annual subscription price. So this is a great deal offered by Brilliant to the viewers of this channel. In this part of the application, we are going to write code to store the state of each collection of items, one for movies and one for albums, in local storage in the user's browser. So at the top, we are creating two consts. One stores the local storage key for the album collection, and the other stores the local storage key for the movie collection. Let's use the useState hook twice once to track the state of the album collection and the other for tracking the state of the movie collection. So based on the datetype value passed into this component, we want to set appropriate variables to the appropriate collection and the function that is used for changing the state of the relevant collection. The local storage key variable is also set based on the relevant datatype value. So this if condition is used for altering the state of the application based on the navigation menu item that the user selects, i.e. to rank movies or to rank albums. So if the user selects the movies navigation menu item, the datatype variable will be set to 1. If the user selects the albums navigation menu item, the datatype variable will be set to 2. A switch between these two values appropriately changes the state of the application, i.e. for ranking movies or for ranking albums, depending on what the user wishes to do. In the return part of the RankItems container.js file, we can return the RankItems component that is being passed the appropriate props. We must of course ensure that the RankItems component is appropriately imported into the RankItems container component. Let's write code to appropriately destructure the relevant props. So we need to modify the useEffect hook code here, so that the API is appropriately called when the datatype prop value changes. The change to the datatype prop value means that the user has clicked a navigation menu item to signal the user's intention to rank items of a different type to the type of items that are currently being ranked, or have just been ranked. So to do this, instead of empty square brackets being passed as the second argument to our useEffect hook, we can pass in the datatype variable wrapped in square brackets instead, like this. We can also include another useEffect hook so that we can save the state of the relevant collection to local storage every time the relevant item collection's state changes in memory. We need to check if the relevant items collection is null in the return code here, like this. Note that we are no longer passing in an empty array to the useState hook. So if the relevant items collection does not exist in local storage, the relevant items collection will be null. So the array will be null. We also need to check to see if our items collection is null before its new state is written to local storage here. Let's also abstract the call to the API into its own function, like this. We only want to call our API if the items collection is null. So if the items collection is null, call the API to bring down the relevant items collection from the server. It is a good idea to clear the items from local storage before we test this code. Excellent, we have now ranked two different types of item sets, movies and albums. So a user may wish to clear the ranking grid and start the whole ranking process again during a session while ranking the relevant items. So this clearing functionality would involve removing all of the items from the ranking grid and all items being loaded back into the non-ranked items list, as it were. So let's implement the code for this by providing a button that the user can click to reset the items so that if relevant items have been ranked, these items will have their ranking values set back to 0. To do this, we can force our component to make an API call to return the relevant items collection to the client in its original state, where none of the items have been ranked. So let's add a button to the return part of the RankItems component, and let's give our button the caption of reload. Let's ensure that we are importing the useState hook into this component. So two variables are returned from the useState hook. The first variable will be used for storing a Boolean value. That when set to true means the user has clicked the reload button, meaning that the user wishes to reload the relevant items in their original unranked state. As discussed, this button click action will force the RankItems component to make a call to the API to refresh the items collection from the server. So let's implement code whereby a call is made to the API when the reload variable's state changes to true. We must also write code to set the reload variable to false when the state of the items collection changes. We can of course do this by calling the setReload function appropriately, like this. Let's make our reload button look a little bit better. So let's go to this website, find a CSS style that we like for our button. And let's integrate the copied CSS code. You can copy the code simply by clicking on one of the buttons here into our application by including the relevant CSS code in our custom.css file. And I think that looks pretty great. I just want to make a quick point here, and this is something that's very easy to forget. You should always include a key attribute for elements that are uniquely identifiable in a list of elements. This helps React identify changes regarding rendering the relevant component. If you like this video, please give this video a thumbs up. And please feel free to share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. Please also consider subscribing to the channel and hit the bell icon so that you'll be notified of future content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description of this video. Any donations will be invested into the channel so that I can continue to provide you with high quality content. I really love reading your comments, so please feel free to leave a comment. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you and take care.